Hello again, Pat. This is reflection number 3. This is going to be about my research related to my internship.
All right, let's talk about research. Can you tell me about the research project related to your internship?
Yes, so yeah, part of like the Gallatin thing besides reflections is that I have to write a paper, and what I envisioned going into it was, something I like to do is trace different figures, related to my concentration. Pat, you're very familiar with my concentration at this point. So I'll kind of like name the figure. So this is the figure I call the addict. And I try to trace them or travel with them through different texts or disciplines or whatever, or find them even. I remember I did unrelated, but an archival project for one of my classes. And I was just trying to find a figure in an archive to be able to even perhaps name them. But I'm also like, the addict, that's a monolith. Like, this person doesn't actually exist. So I'm finding also the like sociocultural imaginary of who this figure is, and I'm looking for where they appear and like how they were born. Maybe, but of course, they're not all born in just one place, but like where they appear most, or like what contributed to them, kind of concretizing into a figure I could actually point to. So that was my idea going into this research project, and I really did think I was going to pull in like queerness into it because I'm working at the LGBT Center, and because I libertarian queer theory so often. But actually, what I found was that I veered off, but I think it was really appropriate. I did write about the addict, but I ended up writing more about race, which actually seems very relevant to this time. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I wrote a lot about space. Actually reminds me of a class I took a couple semesters ago, if you remember, Pat, oh gosh, I don't remember what that school is called, but it was about America and policy and race and space. And this is very much in that realm. And because my research just kept landing there, I was like, okay, I'm going to write some about this. And I ended up doing more of a historical part of it as well. So I was writing about like indigenous populations. What was also really interesting to me, and I placed myself there, but actually I'm sure that some research would have led me there, whether or not I decided to go there, was that I got led into Canadian like writing quite a bit, because that's where like radical recovery communities and writing and like policy and all exists, at least as far as North America goes. And so, yeah, I decided to go there as well. And there's some really interesting writing, and I've been having a good time in my independent research project and whatever else, finding kind of counter public writing. I find a lot of richness in like zines, ephemera, flyers, chapbook, whatever, all these things that are not in the academy. So part of it, I also just read zines about, what the community has to say. And a lot of the writers I found in the more radical spheres do happen to be queer, and they do happen to be trans. And that probably also says something as well. And perhaps I could reflect on that more before I finish my draft, but it didn't land where I actually thought it was going to land, although the kind of like skeleton of what I first proposed when I set out my internship is there. But I'm not mad at it. I think it ended up being a really interesting project that also is the groundwork for like a lot more writing, because there is a part of that paper that could and should be written about queer communities and et cetera, and other communities. So it's like all my writing at Gallatin, basically, and maybe all undergraduate writing. It's kind of just like a gesture towards a much larger thing that I could keep exploring, or somebody maybe ought to keep writing. Not to suggest that I'm the only one who writes about it, but yeah, I like to think that I also, added my own, lens or voice from where I'm standing in relation to, recovery services and, addiction and communities that experience addiction at a higher rate. Yeah.
So, was what you found new information? What were some of your feelings along the way?
Well, in the interest of time, because I spoke a lot on that first question. Long story short, no, it wasn't new information, but I did find new words for things that I maybe only had like noticed or felt, but like didn't have the language for, and yeah, I do think I made some new connections, but it wasn't like surprising. I would say none of it was a surprise, and I did find, that people are thinking about these things like I'm thinking about these things, which is helpful. And I will say, I think some of the more interesting, actually, it was all interesting, but one interesting part was kind of digging through medical and mental health and clinical language around the addicts. And being like, yes, people are pointing to something that I like have thought about, and now, in my last couple semesters, especially with Brad Lewis, last semester has really become a lot clearer to me, even just this year. But it's kind of interesting to be working in a clinical environment and still be using, I was writing about the DSM, but I use the ICD, the international, whatever. It's like the international kind of version of DSM. And so I use this stuff, and I'm also really critical of this stuff, and I'm thinking about this stuff in a critical academic way, and then I'm like going to work and using it anyway, which can create some dissonance. But I feel, and there's also a little bit of like, like rebel feeling, not exactly rebel, but like, I'm in the system, and I am in the system, but I'm also like doing work that is critical of the system, and I'd be lying if I didn't say I wasn't there to try to change some of what's going on by being there and learning in the field, but also like writing and thinking more deeply about it. So my feelings along the way in research, I think I largely answered that, but I think another feeling I can pinpoint is that I get to a lot, and because this degree is historical and global and across so many different disciplines, that feeling of like, wow, this is so much older and so much deeper and so complex. Like it, but then you start reading about it and you're like, this has been building and being passed along and represented in certain ways and talked about in certain ways for so long, and then it affects other like fields, from medicine to psychiatry to law to just that feeling of maybe a little bit of overwhelm, and just like I say, like, I wish I could be a part of changing this, but then that kind of overwhelming feeling of like, I'm David and they're Goliath, and like, how could I possibly change this thing that has just become bigger over time? But I do think there are resistances, and the counter-public writing that I read, suggests so, and the Canadian recovery scene suggests so. So I'm not saying it's hopelessness, but it's just awe and overwhelm.
Lastly, what do you think the role of academia is in relation to this type of work?
Yeah, I would say sometimes I fear that if I just if I keep reading and writing as a scholar, that I'm not going to be affecting, change on the ground or in the field or, at the front lines where things are going down. But I do think academia does play a role. And I also, I think I was writing about this in my internship stuff. I think I do see a way to be both a scholar and a practitioner and have that be very valuable, although you have to kind of be smart about when you're wearing what hat, I think. especially in the field, perhaps if you're right, academically critical. But yeah, I wouldn't, like I was saying, I like learn ways to think about and explain things that I'd only like felt or like kind of seen in the field work, but really hadn't developed any critical thought about. So academia at least helps me do that. But what I'm really interested in is, you know, the academic thought that's coming about, not just stay in academia. It somehow like, you know, trickles into the field. And I do see that in say the zine writing. That is a clear like overlap, but that's not, you know, that doesn't go into the larger public. It's only passed around to people who are kind of looking for it, or if you're in like anarchist circles or like whatever. So happy to see it there, but yeah, I'm interested in how to get that academic thought further into the field, further into policy, further into whatever. But I do think academia plays a role in how things could change for the better. It plays a role in revealing what's going on. Yeah. Okay, that's the end of interview number 3. And next we're going to talk about TGNC recovery.